This is Geography 10. It's Lecture 18. We're going to have to finish the slides from Lecture 17 first. It's also the last class, which means that I need to wrap up with enough time left over for you to complete your course evaluations. This may mean that we need to go a little bit quickly. So let me run through the remaining slides from the last lecture here, and then we'll move on. First, a housekeeping matter. Review session next week. We have this room for the same times that we have class. So Tuesday and Thursday, 9:30 to 11. Seems to myself and the GSIs that one review session makes sense. How many of you would prefer that that happen on Tuesday at 9:30 in this room? How many would prefer Thursday? All right, I'm afraid the Thursday folks have been outvoted. My apologies to those of you who prefer Thursday, especially if you can't make Tuesday. But we will have a review session in this room Tuesday morning at 9:30, okay? If you have further questions, the GSIs encourage you to email them. And perhaps, you also should remember you have this room. If you want to have your own review session, get together and talk about this stuff, you can. All right, any other questions of a housekeeping sort right now? Yes? Will the review session be webcasted? Good question. I'll need to email the webcast people and see if that's possible. I expect it probably is possible. Why don't I write myself a note on the board that I will see on my way out and remind myself to send that email. Whoops. All right, if I don't appear to read that on my way out the door, shout at me, okay? All right, so we need to finish up Davis very quickly here. I did get to this slide last time. There's a chapter of his book, as you know, on slum ecology. He describes the ways in which slums not only tend to lie in areas of high natural hazard, but that they in fact exacerbate those hazards. The combination of being located in areas subject to flooding, areas subject to mudslides, areas subject to earthquakes, combined with the substandard quality of the housing construction that typically is there, combined with the density of people living there, the absence of adequate water and sewage, that sort of thing, create a variety of ways in which the hazards there are multiplied. He provides a sort of generic formula here, risk as a function of hazard and assets, that is what's there to be lost, and the fragility of those assets and constructions. And he suggests that this informal urbanization has multiplied the inherent natural hazards of urban environments. He runs us through a variety of those hazards: flooding and landslides, earthquakes, fires and arson, diseases from contaminated water, polluted air, poor medical systems, traffic injuries and deaths, toxic waste sites. I believe if you read it, you will have a hard time forgetting the story. In some cases, these attributes are actually taken advantage of or manipulated by developers or other parties who are interested in changing these slums, converting them to higher value uses. For example, the story provided of, setting a cat on fire? Is it a cat or a dog? I can't remember. And having it run through the slum as a way of basically setting the place on fire, creating a condition that a sort of disaster that then can be capitalized on in declaring that it's time to bulldoze the place and redevelop it, that kind of thing. Examples here, these should be familiar, I suspect. Digestive tract diseases related to contaminated water are the leading cause of death in the world. The economic cost of road deaths and injuries are nearly twice the amount the developing countries receive in development aid. And African international interest payments, that is the interest they pay on the debt that they hold or that they have incurred, just the interest alone exceeds what is needed to counteract the HIV/AIDS epidemic there. He describes processes of slum clearance. These are also familiar to us by now, I suspect, from various movies and other readings. The forcible relocation of slum dwellers affects hundreds of thousands of people per year. This is frequently undertaken with sort of two sets of objectives. One is the profit motive, property-based objective of redeveloping land, using it for higher value purposes. We saw this in connection with India earlier in the semester. And the other is a more sovereignty-based or political imperative to exert greater social control in the name of, for instance, combating crime. International events such as the Olympic Games have become suitable pretexts for slum clearance and redevelopment in major cities around the world. The need to surveil, control crime, tax the residents, tax the land, or repress informal sector workers if they attempt to organize or exert themselves are all parts of the rationales offered for slum clearance at various places and times. Are there any questions about that? Okay, I want to now sort of segue slightly into questions of inequality. This figure here, the Gini coefficient, is the standard way of measuring and discussing inequality. I want to make sure we understand how this number is arrived at. If you imagine this triangle, and you start here with the poorest member of a given society or place or population, and you take their wealth or their income and you put it here, and then you add the next richest person and next richest person and so forth, and you add them all up until you get to the richest person, so that this triangle represents all of the wealth or all of the income in that population. And then you draw this line where those actual bars come, so to speak, right? So if everybody in the society had the same income or the same wealth, this line would actually be the same as this line, right? Because everybody would have the same amount and the line would go up the same increment with each added person. If you have a lot of inequality, then the first people down here are going to have very small contributions, and this line is going to dip down. If you had no money in the hands of everybody except for one person, if one person had all of the wealth, you would simply move along like this all the way to the end, and then bing, all the way up. The last person would have all the money. Then you look at this area here, which is colored yellow. You calculate its area, and you divide that by the area of the triangle as a whole. Or is it the other way around? Jesus. The point is, the relative size of this wedge to the overall triangle is a way of measuring inequality. A Gini coefficient of 1 would be one in which everybody has, or all the money is in the hands of one person. In other words, this wedge would be the same as this triangle. A Gini coefficient of 0 would be one in which everyone has the exact same amount of wealth or income. In other words, this line, there would be no wedge, essentially. The area of the triangle would be the same. So I guess it's this area divided by the total that gives you the index. Is that right? Somebody with better on their feet math skills want to help correct me? Yes, got it? Okay. Yellow divided by total. Yes. Thank you. Yellow divided by total. So the point here is that if you use this Gini coefficient as a way of measuring inequality, inequality has grown enormously in the last 50 years, and especially in the last 35 to 40 years. It reached record heights in the 1980s, says Davis. Women have been especially hard hit. The world Gini coefficient was 0.67 in 2000, and moreover, areas with high inequality tend to be areas where you find a great deal of social turmoil. If you look at the U.S. Gini coefficient over time, you can see that it has gone up from a little less than 0.4 in 1970 to a little less than 0.5 in 2005. That may not seem like a huge change. You look at the map of the world countries according to their Gini coefficients, you can see that they tend to be lowest in parts of Europe, Australia. They tend to be highest in places like Brazil and South Africa. The United States is sort of in the middle range here. You chart this over time for different countries. You see that Brazil and Mexico have vied for the greatest inequality, generally speaking, over the last 50 years, with Brazil being the highest in the world since about 1980. Most of the countries of Europe and North America have clustered here in the middle, but if you try to look at the overall trends, China going up, the US going up, the UK going up, general pattern of greater inequality in the world. Now, these are some figures from 4 years ago. The richest 2% of the world hold half of the world's assets. Personal wealth distributed so unevenly across the world that the richest 2% own more than 50% of the assets, where the poorest half hold only 1%. Adults with more than $2,200 of assets were in the top half of the global wealth league table. How many of you own a car that's, say, less than 10 years old? Oh, good. Very few of them. It's not worth it around here, is it? Well, if you've got one of those 8-year-old Hondas, you can count yourself in the richest half of the world's population, right? A $2,200 car in and of itself would put you there. Those with more than 61,000 were in the top 10%, according to data from the World Institute for Development Economics Research at the United Nations University. To belong in the top 1% of the world's wealthy adults, you would need more than $500,000, something that 37 million adults have achieved. So much of the world's wealth is concentrated in a few hands that if all of it were distributed evenly, each person would have $20,500 of assets to use. Almost 90% of the world's wealth is held in North America, Europe, and high-income Asian and Pacific countries such as Japan and Australia. While North America has 6% of the world's adult population, it accounts for 34% of household wealth. Then, looking somewhat more recently, The Economist, talking about America's vulnerable economy, reported that as international investors wake up to the relative weakening of Americans' economic power, they will surely question why they hold the bulk of their wealth in dollars. The dollar's decline already amounts to the biggest default in history, having wiped far more off the value of foreigners' assets than any emerging market has ever done. The vigor of emerging economies is good news for the world economy. For its growth, it has much less need of a strong America. The bad news for America is that this in turn may mean that the world also has less need of the dollar. This is perhaps the single most important economic issue that you might think about as you move forward in the next 40 or 50 years of your life. How long will the dollar continue to be the currency of last resort for the world economy, and what will happen at such point that when the financial powers of the world decide that it's not and switch to some other currency? Finally, combating the idea that the suburbs are a land of affluence in the United States, the Associated Press reported that the suburban poor outnumbered their inner city counterparts for the first time last year, with more than 12 million suburban residents living in poverty. Economies are regional now, said Alan Barub of the Brookings Institution, where you see increases in city poverty in almost every metropolitan area. You also see increases in suburban poverty. There's poverty really everywhere in metropolitan areas because there are low-wage jobs everywhere. The president and CEO of the National Urban League said many of the same social and economic problems that have plagued cities for years are now affecting suburbs, struggling schools, rising crime, and low-paying jobs. I call it the urbanization of the suburbs. So finally, sort of wrapping up Davis, coming back to this question of inequality, he suggests that informal survivalism, we talked previously about the informal sector of the economy, is the new primary mode of livelihood in a majority of third world cities. The majority of the slum-dwelling laboring poor are truly and radically homeless in the contemporary international economy. Informal capital is really about myriad invisible networks of exploitation. Space for new entrants is provided only by a diminution of per capita earning capacities and or by the intensification of labor despite declining marginal returns. He terms this urban involution, a situation in which the growing numbers of people do not result in growing economic activity and prosperity, but in fact quite the opposite, as the problems associated with urbanization far outstrip the capacities of either the state or formal sector, private entities, economic actors, to keep up with it and make use of it in a more productive fashion. He calls the pockets where the affluent increasingly fortify and barricade themselves in off-world a fundamental reorganization of metropolitan space in which there are slums on the one hand and gated communities on the other. An emphasis on private security and other services aimed towards protecting these enclaves of affluence. Communication and transportation systems are designed specifically to reduce contact between the classes, to enable those with wealth to move around in ways that protect them or isolate them from contact with those who are not so wealthy. And we'll come back to this in another context later in the lecture. So here we see some examples pulled off of the web of some of these off-worlds. These are actually not from the United States. These are from other parts of the world. The emphasis on razor wire can be seen. I don't know how many of you have walked around some of these cities in the poorer parts of the world and looked at these kinds of places. Anybody walked around Cape Town, for example, and admired the razor wire and the signs advertising the private security forces that will come and get you if you attempt to intrude? So you can think of these places. I think Davis is trying to call our attention to the idea that these places are not somehow disconnected from the slums. They are, in fact, simply the other side of the same coin. They are related to, internally related to, the emergence of slums. This is a reaction to it and also an expression of the same forces that generate the slums. Indeed, peri-urban poverty, a grim human world largely cut off from the subsistence solidarities of the countryside, as well as disconnected from the cultural and political life of the traditional city, is the radical new face of inequality. All right, that was a little rapid. Are there any questions on Davis? Let's move on to today's lecture, for which the reading was the last chapter of Delaney. Coming back full circle to the idea of territory, he uses the case of what he calls Palesraelestine, Israel and Palestine, as a way of illustrating the arguments he has tried to make in the rest of the book about territory and territoriality. And he suggests that this is a remarkable case for thinking about these things. Before I go on, I want to ask if any of you have been following the events in Arizona the last week or so. Yes, what's the new law in Arizona? I lived there for a long time, so it hits kind of close to home. Yeah. Okay, there's a new state law according to which state and municipal legal authorities, police, can demand verification of your citizenship anytime they happen to have an encounter with you, ostensibly for another reason. They're ostensibly not supposed to do this just for the purpose of demanding an identity card. But, of course, one wonders exactly how easily that line can even be maintained, right? Anybody want to reflect on what this signifies in terms of Delaney's arguments about reterritorialization? Is this a reterritorializing of Arizona? And if so, how? Maybe I should just say it is. How is it? What are some of the ways that we might consider this to be a reterritorialization of Arizona? Yeah?
Well, now you're just straight up not allowed to be there if you're not a citizen, so that's the thing.
Well, you weren't allowed to be there if you weren't a citizen to begin with, right? That law, I mean... Okay, this is a nice illustration of Delaney's arguments about verticality. Because what's changed is not whether it's legal or not to be in the state of Arizona without being a citizen of the United States. What's changed is actually the level at which that law will be enforced. And this is why this law is likely to, well, is definitely going to be challenged in the courts and is likely to be thrown out. Because citizenship has traditionally been treated by the courts as a federal matter, federal jurisdiction. Generally speaking, the courts have not allowed state authorities or municipal authorities, such as your local police officers, to enforce federal citizenship laws. What this law does essentially says, we're going to take this enforcement duty ourselves at the state level. What else does this particular piece of legislation do? Anybody read the part about what if you live in Arizona and you feel like this law isn't being enforced sufficiently? You know what you can do? Yeah. You can sue your local government simply on the grounds that you're a citizen and they're failing, in your opinion, to enforce this law. So that if, say, a particular city in Arizona were to say publicly, well, this is what the state law says, but we don't think this is right, and we're going to instruct our police officers not to do this. The citizens of that city who disagreed with that type of approach would have the standing under this law to sue their own city, which is another kind of alteration of the rules affecting the territoriality of Arizona. And we'll come back to Arizona at the end here as well, provided that I go quickly enough through the rest of the lecture. But this is I've done work for the last 15 years in the borderlands of Arizona, and this is all rather painfully close to home for me. Yes? After class today on Sproul, there will be a demonstration against this law. Thank you for that public service announcement. All right. The last reading for the semester, Chapter 4 of Delaney, about Powell-Israelstein. Oh, shoot, an update. This is the reading. Final exam Wednesday, the 12th, 1:55 to now 11:30. Oh, there are plenty of chairs in 1:55 to now, right? All right. So the only thing I have to add to that is if you are a DSP student, you should go instead to 575 Macomb, which is the same place where the DSP midterm took place. Okay? That's the room we have reserved for those students. All right. Start with Zionism. The motivating ideology of the creation of Israel, which emerged, the state of Israel didn't come along until later, but the ideology of Zionism emerged in Europe in the late 19th century in response to widespread anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews throughout Europe and other parts of the diaspora. It was, in a sense, a nationalist solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. And it was advocated by prominent Jews, foremost among them this man, Theodor Herzl, who came up with this idea that if the Jews are not safe in Europe, there should be a place where they can be and have their own nation, ideally their own state, because it was precisely their persecution within the nation states elsewhere that seemed to be this chronic, ongoing problem with a very long history. In parts of Europe, it was outright persecution. In other parts of Europe, it was the contradictions associated with assimilation, in which prominent, successful Jews were, on the one hand, sort of inside high society, and on the other hand, excluded from high society. And this was a very pointed problem in a lot of parts of Europe. The Dreyfus Affair in 1895 provided a great deal of motivation and momentum to this movement. Anybody know what the Dreyfus Affair was? None of you? Yeah. Okay. Right. A soldier, an officer in the French military was accused, and Émile Zola, a prominent intellectual, wrote a very famous essay called J'accuse, in which he contested this. And there was a huge flaring up over whether this was a legitimate persecution, or whether it was in fact just a case of anti-Semitism. Herzl's formulation of Zionism and advocacy of it came out of that foment about the Dreyfus Affair, in which he built on an already existing movement and gave it a great deal more momentum by actually promoting it among non-Jewish politicians and leaders in Europe, and also securing funding, raising funds from Jewish and non-Jewish sources, but especially from very wealthy Jews in Europe, to help push this diaspora nationalism, this idea that they should secure a homeland, and that homeland, after various debates and other proposals, focused on Jerusalem and what's now known as Israel and Palestine. Yes?
Sorry, what was Dreyfus accused of?
What was Dreyfus accused of? God, I don't remember. I believe it was some kind of treason, or spying, espionage. Yes. Okay.